everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Diana Conway. I have the great honor of being president of Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club. It's nice to be in person, isn't it? So this is our first in-person luncheon in over 2 years, and we have with us today a legal luminary, Chuck Rosenberg. The last time we had Mr. Rosenberg was almost 3 years ago, the day that the Mueller report was released, and he was literally reading it in the car on his way out to see us. I want to first recognize a couple people in the room. First, our hostess, Dr. Kademian. Could you? I'd also like to ask our students in attendance to stand for a second or wave. Generation of voters and activists. And then we've got a couple of elected officials I just want to recognize. We've got Brenda Wolf from the school board. Mayor Jeff Slavin of, you know what, hold your applause. Mayor Jeff Slavin of the town of Somerset. Nothing personal, Jeff, he's over here. I think Teresa Warman is here from the Central Committee. Yeah, she should make it. Okay, we've got our name tag. Shruti Bhatnagar is here from the Central Committee. And Roger Blatlow is here from Leisure World at Montgomery County, Democrats, of course. And Jackie Rivera-Oven is here from Gabe Albornoz, Councilmember Gabe Albornoz's office. They're all working today, so none of our county elected officials are here, or the state delegates. We've got Kathleen Connor from Janie Raskin's office, and Krista Burton also from Janie Raskin's office. And did I miss anybody? I apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. Nice to see you. Sorry. Gloria Abel. Thank you for joining us. Gloria.
Next year.
You know, I haven't done this in a while, I apologize. A quick word about WDC. We work to elect Democrats after the primaries, and we work specifically on issues that disproportionately affect women and children, which basically means anything that's got somebody's hair on fire who wants to come forward and help us advocate for that. We have an increasing footprint in Annapolis with our state legislature, and now more and more also with the county council, and we're excited to work on every kind of issue from affordable housing to paid family leave, criminal justice reform, and we're going to also start working more and more on environmental issues, which basically the two things we care about most are democracy and the environment. Can't have one without the other. We have a very hard-working board. I'm going to ask the whole board to stand at once, please, if you would. Thank you for your service. We offer you the chance to come forward and participate in any of these committees at whatever level you can, including very light one-time explorations. We've got a membership committee with Enid Light, a community education committee with Gloria Aparicio, and that is specifically geared toward issues of more regional and county-based importance, so the school systems, public health, all over the map. Programs is Barbara Zelenka, who organized today's program, and our events chair is Tazeen Ahmed, who organized today's program. Communications is Lisa Fuller, who gets all the emails out with a strong crew behind her. Mary Lou Fox is our treasurer and is looking for a co-chair, so if you are good with any of those spreadsheets or would like to be trained to do that, great. And we have advocacy chair Joanne Korovos, who coordinates all the advocacy in the county and at the state level. And Fatmata, I think, is not here, but we have a new chair of a committee called Partnership and Outreach, which used to be chaired by Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller, former board member. So Fatmata is going to be working on growing our coordination with other civic groups that are specifically focused in the same direction. So we have those connections, and when something comes up that requires action, we know each other, we trust each other, and we're ready to speak with the same voice. A quick word about our next programs. February 3rd will be a virtual program with Dr. Fiona Hill, the Ukraine hearings. That should sort of do it for you. She's been with us once before, has released a book in the meantime called There Is Nothing For You Here. February 21st, we will be hosting Jason Green to talk about a more local issue of collaboration, racism, and the history of the county. There should be handouts on all the tables. That's February 21st. for Black History Month. In March, we'll host Lieutenant Governor Erwin Miller for Women's History Month. Not yet scheduled is the annual Tommy Raskin Memorial Fund for People and Animals. We do an annual speaker chosen by the family, along with our chairs, Lynn Olson and Fran Rothstein, to come up with a speaker that would fit with the mission that Tommy cared so much about. And we always want your ideas on speakers and programs, especially if you have a connection to the featured speaker you'd like us to do. We're assembling programs on gun safety, reproductive health care, the blueprint for Maryland's future, and of course the environment. But we're here to talk about he who shall not be named, and the various efforts to hold him accountable, the steadily growing number of cases filed, pled, gone to trial, or sentenced, and the person who just got a thumbs up from Meta to get back onto their platform. Right. Good rumble. So in December 2022, the Trump Organization was convicted of all 17 counts of tax fraud by the Manhattan DA. There's a federal grand jury, there's a Department of Justice investigation. We've had high hopes before, impeachment 1, impeachment 2, Mueller report, and we've seen those hopes dashed. But we have to continue to believe in the institutions behind our democracy. So I take the turnout today, even in the teeth of COVID, as a sign of ongoing faith. I've heard it compared to a sea of Watergates, but without the pushback from the president's party. Republicans took a beating and then decided they didn't care, and that power is the value that they worry most about. They did not even have a platform during the last presidential cycle. On to today's speaker. Mr. Chuck Rosenberg is a distinguished public servant with decades of law enforcement experience across the uppermost echelons of multiple federal agencies. Originally from New York, a bachelor's at Tufts and a JD from University of Virginia in 1990. He was hired straight out of law school through the Attorney General's Honors Program. Served in numerous positions through Department of Justice with Robert Mueller, John Ashcroft, James Comey, nominated by George W. Bush and unanimously confirmed by the Senate to serve as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, and spent time working in private practice at various stages at Hunton and William, Hogan and Lovells, and Crowell and Mooring. I probably missed some things in there. Most remarkably was the 2017 memo that Mr. Rosenberg issued after the then president urged law enforcement to be rough with suspects. And as Mr. Rosenberg put it at the time, the president, in remarks delivered yesterday in New York, condoned police misconduct regarding the treatment of individuals placed under arrest by law enforcement. I write to offer strong reaffirmation of the operating principles to which we, as law enforcement professionals, adhere. I write because we have an obligation to speak out when something is wrong. That's what law enforcement officers do. That's what you do. We fix stuff. At least we try. The Washington Post editorial wrote a piece entitled, "A Divided Nation Gets Moral Guidance, but Not from Trump," and wrote, "His letter was important not as a rebuke to the president, but as a model of leadership and courage in reaffirming democratic values. Chuck combines a laser-sharp intellect, a resume to match, and a highly accessible style of speaking. So it is my singular honor to present this remarkable public servant whose understanding of the ongoing cases is matched with, I think, a twinkle in the eye."
Thank you so much. What Diana didn't tell you about my degree from the University of Virginia Law School in 1990 is that she was my classmate. So, I don't think she knew who I was, but we nevertheless go back more than 30 years. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I'm truly honored to do it, so thank you for inviting me. What you will see is that if you invite me somewhere, particularly if it includes food, I'm willing to accept. I wanted to speak for a few minutes about something that Diana touched on that's incredibly important to me. But what I mostly want to do is take your questions and try and answer them. and to explain some of this stuff that continues to bedevil us. It's hard, it's confusing. I know some people are anxious about it. I would urge you not to be. But let me just start where I was going to start. Diana mentioned the rule of law. And I've often said when I speak publicly that the rule of law is a construct. Right? It's something that men and women have created, that they nurture, that they safeguard. But it's not something that automatically happens. Diana, this may be your phone.
No, that's the
a
speaker.
recording device that's recording your lecture.
Okay, well, I'm going to use it as a prop. Because the law of gravity applies everywhere all the time. And so if I were to let go of it, it would hit the ground. And that would be true in places that don't have functional governments. It would be true in stateless societies. It would be true in Somalia, and Libya, and Sudan. The law of gravity applies everywhere all the time. But the rule of law is completely different. It only applies, it only works, it only functions if we actually take care of it. And so I'm often asked, is it endangered? Might we lose it? And the answer is, it's always endangered. And we always might lose it unless we take affirmative steps to protect it. And one way we do that, and by the way, I'm biased here. Whenever I'm biased, I'll tell you right up front, I'm biased. We do it by ensuring that people are treated in a fair and just way in our criminal justice system. Now, by the way, we're imperfect. We get lots of stuff wrong. Any organization, including this one, Diana, that is comprised of human beings, gets stuff wrong because we're fallible. So the reason I wrote that memo to my workforce, in light of what President Trump had condoned during a speech in Suffolk County, New York in the summer of 2017, is to remind people that we have a moral, legal, and ethical obligation to take care of people, including people in our custody. And you've seen stories from around the country where cops don't always do that. And it's heartbreaking, and it's disgusting, and it's terrifying. But most of the men and women with whom I work in the Department of Justice try really hard to get stuff right. And I think most of the time they do. You know, I think we have to be two things in the Department of Justice always. We have to be actually fair, because being anything less than actually fair is unbelievably dangerous. And we have to be perceived as actually fair, which is a different thing. Right? If we're actually fair, but we're not perceived that way, that's a problem. And if we're perceived as actually fair, but we are actually unfair, that's a different sort of problem. And what I'm really worried about right now is the perception of fairness in the Department of Justice and in the FBI. I'm biased again in the following way. My wife and I are married way over my head, as almost all men do. I have two children. Our baby, our little one, our 6'3" little one, is a brand new FBI special agent. Just graduated from the FBI Academy and got sent somewhere on his first assignment. By the way, they don't get to pick where they go. And that would be really obvious if you knew where he ended up. But I worry about the way that we think about the men and women who choose this career and how we treat them. And I worry, of course, for their safety, not just my sons, but all of his colleagues. And I worry that their work is not perceived as fair when I actually believe that is exactly what they strive to be. Now, these are all things we can talk about, but probably can't fix right here and right now. But it was just something that was on my mind, and Diana sort of triggered it when she mentioned the rule of law, because it is something so precious to our society. It's something that we take for granted, and something, by the way, we can lose. I don't expect we will. I'm an optimist, not a pessimist. I think we will have it, but we need to nurture it, and we need to care for it. Because if we lose it, our problems are going to look much worse than they look right now. Let me also say something, and you alluded to this too, Diana, about investigations that are ongoing and special counsels and the like. I want to give you a little bit of history. and I want to compare it to what's going on right now. You all remember Ken Starr, the Whitewater investigation? So Ken Starr was an independent counsel. It's a very different thing statutorily than a special counsel. And I'm going to explain the difference in a way that I hope makes sense. An independent counsel functioned pursuant to a statute that expired in 1999, I believe. Ken Starr was essentially the last independent counsel. And the statute made the independent counsel, a shocking development, independent. Independent of the Department of Justice, not bound by the rules, not subordinate to the Attorney General, truly, functionally, statutorily independent. Now, Ken Starr still had to go, as all independent counsels did, to a panel of judges, so outside of the executive branch, for authority to do certain things. But he had no reporting obligation to the Attorney General of the United States, meaning he made all decisions about prosecutions on his own, and the statute permitted that. A lot of people think that Ken Starr went too far. A lot of people thought that a lot of independent counsels went too far. And so when that statute, the statute lapsed in 1999 and was never renewed. We needed something in its place because sometimes the Department of Justice and Attorneys General think that they ought to be recused from ongoing, big, sensitive, messy investigations. So the Department of Justice promulgated in 2000 the special counsel regulations. Not the independent counsel statute, but the special counsel regulations. And the special counsel, under those regulations, is absolutely subordinate to the Attorney General. The Attorney General of the United States, under the regulations, doesn't supervise the special counsel on a day-to-day basis, but is responsible for the final determination of the case. Why did Bob Mueller, a special counsel, give his report to the Attorney General? Because he must, under the regulations. Why did the Attorney General determine whether or not that report would be released? Because it was his determination under the regulations. So we no longer have a truly independent counsel structure. We have this special counsel thing, but that person is subordinate to the Attorney General. That might make you feel good right now, because the Attorney General is Merrick Garland. I have enormous respect for Mr. Garland. But we know that special counsels sort of outlive and outlast the folks who appoint them. And so it's entirely possible that Jack Smith's work as special counsel in the Trump investigation or Rob Hur's work as special counsel in the Biden investigation outlive this administration and this Attorney General. And then some other Attorney General gets to make a final determination in those cases. I wrote an article, I think in November, maybe December, right after Jack Smith was appointed. I don't know Mr. Smith, but I know people who work with him and they think very highly of him. And I accept that he is an outstanding choice as special counsel. But what I wrote was, I think it's a mistake to have a special counsel. We need an investigation of Mr. Trump. We need a rigorous investigation of Mr. Trump. But I trust the Department of Justice to do it in its own way, with its own career professionals, under the procedures and policies and processes it has always used. Because, and one of my main concerns was, the special counsel is still subordinate to the Attorney General. The Attorney General still makes the final determination. So what are you actually purchasing in terms of distance? And I think the answer is not very much. So I'm not saying we ought not, that's a double negative, so I've already lost my train of thought. We should conduct these investigations in a fair and rigorous way. But I trust the Department of Justice to do it in the ways it has always done it. Here's another reason why, and I hope this makes sense. Remember, we have to be both fair and perceived as fair. And we have to be both of those things all the time. And I worry about that. And I think sometimes attorneys general, by the way, that is the right plural. I used to say it wrong all the time and got corrected. It's not attorney generals, it's attorneys general, who care deeply about the department, as Mr. Garland does, believe that by, let's say, appointing someone from a Republican administration like Rob Hur, who, by the way, was your U.S. attorney here in Maryland, to appoint Mr. Biden, they buy some, oh, I don't know, credibility perhaps, or acceptance. But if you think about it, that's a political decision. You're appointing someone, and again, I think highly of Rob Hur. It's nothing against Rob Hur, but you're appointing a Republican to investigate a Democrat. If you think further, the Biden administration, and I am very supportive of Mr. Biden and his goals and his policies, retained a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Delaware, also a highly respected guy, to conduct the Hunter Biden investigation. So again, we asked a Republican to investigate a Democrat, we asked a Democrat to investigate a Republican. I think all of that is a perilous path. I don't think we're buying true independence or credibility when we're picking people for political reasons, whether it's a Democrat to investigate a Republican or a Republican to investigate a Democrat. For goodness sake, let's get the best man or woman we can find with the most experience and the most credibility to run the investigation. And because the special counsel regulations make the Attorney General ultimately responsible for determinations, let's keep it within the normal channels. Because I think we, in a way, are over-engineering this. And I don't think it's a good or helpful path. And again, I don't know Jack Smith, but people I know and trust say he's terrific. So I accept that. And I do know Rob Hur, and I believe he's honest and credible and thoughtful, and I accept that. But I really wish we would stop making decisions based on politics when we're talking about our criminal justice system, and let the men and women of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's community do their work. Because I think that undermines the perception, and perception matters a lot. Let me just say also a few words about classified documents. You may have seen that in the news on occasion. I think I might be the only person who doesn't have classified information in their garage.
Double check.
I did double check. But now you have me worried, so as soon as I'm finished here, I'm going to go triple check. So for many years, when I was a federal prosecutor, by the way, Diana mentioned that I had been appointed to one job by President Bush. It's true. I was also appointed to one job by President Obama. And I'm proud of the fact that I could be appointed by presidents of different parties with different philosophies, because I hope that they were appointing somebody who tries to live their life sort of on the 50-yard line, forgive the football analogy, but in the middle. But I had a top secret SCI clearance, top secret / sensitive compartmented information clearance for years, and treated classified information that I read, which I was briefed, with the absolute utmost care. I think overwhelmingly that's what people do. You know, I've heard a number of members of Congress on both sides say that there's an epidemic, it's systemic. I heard one senator say yesterday that everybody under the sun has mishandled classified information. I think that's false. I think there are millions of men and women who have had and currently have classified clearances to handle classified information, and that they take this really seriously. Okay, that aside, there's been clearly some folks at the upper echelons of the executive branch, Trump, Biden, and Pence come to mind, who've run into problems. Now, I don't think these guys cut their own grass, and so my guess is that they didn't pack their boxes when they left office. If you're going to prosecute somebody for mishandling classified information, then you have to show that they did it intentionally, right? I mean, if you get something wrong on your taxes, that's not a crime. If you get something wrong on your taxes intentionally, that is a crime. And so intentionality matters a lot. That's why you do investigations, to determine whether or not Trump or Biden or Pence or somebody who worked for them acted intentionally. I can't tell you, with respect to any of those three people, whether the mere fact that they find something in Mar-a-Lago or Wilmington or Carmel, Indiana, means that that person, Trump or Pence or Biden, intentionally took classified information out of their office, put it in a box, and moved it to the garage next to their Corvette or what have you. I don't know that. And that's why you do investigations. I don't rule it out. It's entirely plausible. One of the other things that the FBI does when they look at these investigations is to try and figure out whether anyone else acted intentionally. It's not just necessarily Trump or Pence or Biden, but maybe somebody else intentionally took this stuff. Maybe they did it at the behest of one of these people. I don't know. But that's why we do investigations. And I think these are hard investigations because proving intent is always the most difficult thing for a prosecutor to do. Right? I didn't do violent crime, I prosecuted violent crime, huge difference. But when I prosecuted violent crime, right, you knew you had a crime, you just had to figure out whether you had the right person. But in this white-collar milieu environment, you know you have the right person, you just have to figure out whether or not you have a crime. And that almost always turns on intentionality, and that's hard. And so Diana, you referenced earlier being disappointed, and I share some of that. But I also know that that's a very hard thing for prosecutors to prove, to actually crawl into someone's brain and figure out what they were trying to do. And you do that in a really careful, methodical way, because if you bring charges, you really only have one shot at it, right? You don't get to do it, you don't get a do-over. I'm not a golfer, but you don't get a mulligan, right? You don't get to do it again. And so some people I know have been frustrated that this stuff is taking too long. And there's some truth to that. It's taking a while, there's no question about it, but I would much rather have it go slowly than poorly, right? I'd much rather have accuracy instead of speed. I'd like both, but you don't always get that, and these are hard investigations. One other word about classified information. I wrote an article today, I think Politico published it today, or they threw it in the garbage. It's absolutely one of the two. But the point I tried to make in the Politico article, well, a couple of points, but I've heard people say that the reason that Trump, Pence, and Biden ended up with stuff in their garage that they shouldn't have had is because there's this massive problem of overclassification with respect to the intelligence community. And I'm here to tell you that that's both true and completely irrelevant to the problem. First, the true part. There's lots of stuff that is classified at a level higher than it needs to be classified. There's lots of stuff classified that doesn't need to be classified at all. And there's a lot of stuff that is classified for too long and could be declassified, which would be beneficial to transparency and accountability, something that the government should always strive to be, accountable and transparent. Right? So I do believe there is an overclassification problem. I don't think it's nefarious. If you are working in the bowels of the CIA and you have original classification authority, and you have to make a choice between classifying something or not classifying it, or classifying it at a top secret level or only a secret level, which way would you expect you would rather make an error, right? Right. You're not going to get in trouble for overclassifying something. Nothing bad happens to you or your agency or the men and women out in the field if you overclassify. But if you underclassify, that could cause problems. And so I think when people make mistakes, and we're human, so we make plenty of them, they tend to overclassify. So yeah, there's an overclassification problem. Let's accept that premise. That said, that's not the issue. If you are in receipt of classified information, you don't get to decide for yourself, I think this is overclassified. I'd really like this to be declassified. Or, this was really interesting, I'm just going to take it home with me. You don't get to do that. And so overclassification is not an excuse. Let me say one other thing. I talked about this on the Rachel Maddow. By the way, if you're a Rachel Maddow fan, I'm here to tell you that she's absolutely a delightful human being. Unbelievably smart, and also really kind and humble. And a Rhodes Scholar from Stanford, if you didn't know that. But we were talking about this very issue on her show once, and I said, let me give you an example. Let's say your great aunt, and I used the name Barbara, but that was when my mom was alive. Her name was Barbara. She used to like watching Rachel Maddow, so that was a way for me to say hello to her on television. Let's say your great aunt Barbara is running a small, hostile nation. She's a dictator. And I think it freaked her out because she said, oh my God, I do have an Aunt Barbara. So I assure you I didn't know that, but let's just continue with the example. And let's say we have a document that's classified at the top secret level in which we see that she likes to eat Nutella with a red plastic spoon. It's like, why is that classified? Like, how could that be important enough to classify at the top secret level? It seems so trivial, so benign. Who cares whether the dictator of a small, foreign, hostile country likes to eat Nutella with a red plastic spoon? Who doesn't, by the way? But here's the problem that you don't know as the recipient, as the consumer of that information. How did the CIA get it? It's possible that there's a highly placed mole. And by the way, I'm making this up. I don't know any of this to be true, but I don't believe Rachel Maddow's great aunt is named Barbara, or runs a hostile foreign government, or eats Nutella with a red plastic spoon. So I'm making all of this up. But let's say we have at the CIA a highly placed mole in that government, reporting on the great leader's dietary habits. So some of what you get is going to be unbelievably trivial and benign. You're sort of the who cares category. But if that document gets leaked, what do you think happens to that staffer in that country?
Exposed.
Well, exposed at best. Another EX word at worst. Executed. So you don't get to decide based on the contents of a document that it's overclassified. We may have also learned about Great Aunt Barbara's Nutella preference because we have some other sort of technical penetration, none of which I can talk about publicly, even in a fictional country. But overclassification, while a problem, is not the answer. The answer, I think, is somebody was, and I don't know who that somebody is until the FBI finishes their investigation, unbelievably sloppy. That is the best thing you can say about those three men. Now, they may not have done it themselves, but somebody did. There was a leakage in the process somewhere, and it's unbelievably sloppy and also dangerous. Because the odds of someone sort of rooting around in Joe Biden's garage and finding a highly classified document that actually exposes a source and then leaks it so the source gets killed, that number is pretty close to zero. But it's not zero. And so you have to be really careful with this stuff. I'm also a little mystified because I remember when I worked for Director Mueller, I had the privilege of working on his staff right after 9/11. I adore, I may have told you this story last time, I'm going to tell it again. what the heck. I adore that man. I would walk barefoot on broken glass for Bob Mueller. And by the way, that's what it felt like every single day. Did I tell you the story about my interview with him?
No.
Yes, no? Yes, no, and I don't care with the three names. So, after 9/11, Bob had an opening on his staff. I had not met the man, but he's an icon in our department, and obviously the FBI was at the forefront of the post-9/11 investigation. So, through a friend of a friend, I got an interview with him for that job. He only had a staff of 3, so it was one of the 3 positions. And Bob, I don't know how to describe, taciturn would overstate how much he likes to talk. Right? So I'm ushered into his office. He's standing behind his desk. He comes out from behind his desk. He doesn't say hello or good morning or shake my hand. Nice to meet you. None of that, because that is all a waste of time. He says, "Why do you want to work here?" And I tell him why I want to work there. He says, "Why do you think you'd be any good at this?" And I tell him why I think he'd be good at this. By the way, this story has lasted 4 times longer than the actual interview. And at that point, he says, "Okay, thanks for coming by," and he ushers me out of the office. That was it. Over. And this man hates me. This is awful. Like I didn't do anything, so I couldn't possibly have offended him, I'm thinking. But he hates me. It's a disaster. I'll never get the job. And on the way out, I see a baseball on one of his shelves. I love baseball. And I figure, all right, I'll strike up a conversation with Bob Mueller about baseball. This will work. I'll salvage the interview. I'll get the job. I say, "I see you're a baseball fan." He goes, "Nope." And out the door I go. I call my wife. She said, "How did it go?" And I said, it was a disaster. He hates me. And she says, "You never know." And I said, "No, I do know." And of course, wives are always right, and husbands are always wrong, because about an hour later my phone rings. He doesn't say hello. He doesn't say it was nice to meet you. He just says, "Mueller here, when can you start?" I said, 2 weeks. He said, "See you in 2 weeks," and he hung up on me. I love that man. None of that tells you why, but he's just honest and true and decent and believes fervently that we have to be in the Department of Justice and other, 2 separate words, and other, not Republicans, not Democrats, people who live their lives on the 50-yard line and call them like we see them. And if we lose that, we're in deep trouble. I would be delighted to take any questions that you have about any topic at all. Diane, do you have a way of doing this? Oh, please.
You don't want to do it around?
Feel much better making Diana choose.
Field question.
So I just want everyone to understand this was a minor technical miracle that, having been shown how to do it, I turned on the microphone. So please raise your hands, be prepared to have it be a question. And true to form, if you've been to an event that I've hosted before as president, I'm going to start with the first question. You mentioned the 50-yard line. Has the Supreme Court lost that credibility?
I think that's right, they have the same requirement, Diana. They have to be fair, they have to be perceived that way. And if you look at Gallup polling, people have lost faith in that institution. Now let me put that in context. People have lost faith in all of our institutions, in Congress, in the presidency, in the media, in big business, and certainly the Supreme Court. You know, I teach undergraduates at Georgetown in the fall and at Gettysburg College in the spring. And the first thing we talk about is Marbury versus Madison, the 1803 Supreme Court case that I paid no attention to when we were classmates. But that looms so large for me now, in which the court said it is our obligation to pronounce what the law is. It's the first time that ever happened. Hamilton wrote about that in Federalist 78, but no court of the United States had ever actually pronounced it. And you were probably a much better student than me, Diana.
I didn't come out of law school and go into an honors program at DOJ.
Well, if you saw my grades, you would wonder why I did, but we have always, as a nation, accepted what the Supreme Court has said. They have no enforcement authority. By the way, how does the Supreme Court enforce its decisions? They can't. They can't. They rely on a different branch of government, the executive branch, to do that. And so, has the Supreme Court lost some credibility? Absolutely, all of our institutions have. It is particularly dangerous, though, if we stop, and I'm not talking about the Supreme Court now, but more broadly, the courts of the United States. If we don't trust them, we don't trust their processes, we don't trust their people, because remember, they have no enforcement authority. And I think it's part of a dangerous trend.
Please, Ms.
Hi, Susan. How much in trouble are we, or do you expect now that Republicans in the House are on these high-level committees?
We actually have some experts in the room who could probably speak to that more cogently than me. I don't think we're in trouble, Susan, in the following way. I don't know that they can do anything, right? Don't mistake heat for light. You can make a lot of noise, and they can make a lot of people uncomfortable, and they can say things that will make you, gnash your teeth and shake your fist, but I'm not sure they can do anything, at least legislatively, right? The Senate remains in Democratic hands. You have a Democrat in the White House. So, I would look to the people who are here, like Kathleen from, our legislative branch, to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's going to be more heat than light. Yes. I'm not in charge of follow-ups. Diana is, so.
Just in terms of them having access to high intelligence.
Yeah, so in terms of members of Congress having access to intelligence products, members of Congress, all members of Congress, whether they're in the majority or minority, have clearances and have access to information. They don't get everything they want just for asking. Remember, Mr. Trump and his White House withheld lots of information from the Congress on a variety of bases, including executive privilege. Mr. Biden's going to do the exact same thing, right? Usually, by the way, that process works itself out through accommodation. One side gives a little, the other side gives a little. They meet in the middle. It did not seem like the Trump administration was very accommodating. It remains to be seen what the Biden administration provides, but a chairman in the House doesn't get everything that she wants just because she asks for it.
Hello, I'm a great Aunt Barbara. But mine is a statement more than a question, really, I suppose. It's about classified information. I'd like to know who classifies information, what department or agency. Do they keep track of who they distribute this information to? It should be kept track of, and they should make sure that it gets returned. And none of that is done. If you go into a legislator's office, if they go to a meeting and are given a piece of information, they go back to their office, they give it to their chief of staff, and it should be kept closer track of, and the person who is distributed it should make sure they get it returned.
All right, so excellent points, Barbara. Let me say it this way. Different agencies have different people who have classification authority. FBI, CIA, NSA, ODNI, right? Different agencies of government have people who are permitted to classify documents. Overwhelmingly, but not perfectly, documents are tracked and retrieved. An example, when I worked for Director Mueller, we would get a CIA briefer come to the director's office in the morning and brief us on the highest level threat information post 9/11 possessed by the United States government. He would walk in, he would unzip a bag, he would unlock it, unzip it, he would take out 5 copies of the report, all of them were numbered, he'd slide them to each of us, he would brief us from that paper, and then he would collect all 5, put it back in the bag, zip it, and lock it, and leave. When I was a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia, working on we had some very significant national security cases in our office. Oliver James, Robert Hansen, the 9/11 prosecution. We handled classified information in an extraordinarily careful way. We had a SCIF in our office, a secure compartmented information facility. If you went in, you had to do it with a lock and tumbler. You had to sign into a line, you had a badge in, so there was an electronic recording of your entry. You had to do the same thing on the way out. So overwhelmingly, my experience is that there is a very good tracking system for highly classified information. Obviously, it's not perfect. And at the very top of the food chain, so now we're talking about presidents and vice presidents, if they wanted to take a briefing back to their I guess in the White House, not that they would ever let me upstairs, but upstairs to their bedroom or their study, who's going to stop them? Right? And maybe that's where the leakage occurred. I don't know. I can tell you as a line guy at the line level handling this stuff, we were extraordinarily careful. There was a real significant process to retrieve and document and collect and maintain in good order the classified information that we use. So there's obviously a breakdown in the system. That's abundantly clear. But I saw people take that obligation very seriously at my level. Of course, my level was pretty darn low.
Somehow that's not the impression that the rest of us have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary Lou, what charges will be brought, do you believe, against President Trump?
Well, Mary Lou, you're jumping to the end of the story. I thought you were going to ask me how much time he's going to spend in jail. I don't know what charges will be brought because I don't know if charges will be brought. I mentioned earlier, look, when I read the Mueller report, and I read it carefully, by the way, it was so interesting to me on television. We spent months talking about the report before it was issued, and nobody had read it. And then we spent months talking about the report after it was issued, and it seemed like nobody had read it. But if you read volume 2, the Mueller team outlines in great detail obstructive conduct by the former president, which I thought rose to the level of criminality. And I believe that if other people did that in the course of an ongoing federal investigation, obstructed justice in that way, they would have been charged. But he wasn't. Now, part of that turned on the fact that the Department of Justice has a policy that you can't charge a sitting president. Great, he's not a sitting president anymore. And the statute of limitations has probably run on most of that conduct, but I'd have to check my math. In any event, charging people, as I alluded to earlier, because you have to prove intentionality is really hard. Let me give you an example. Let's say the president called the Secretary of State in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, and said, you need to find me 11,780 votes. Imagine something crazy like that happened. Is that a crime? Just based on that?
Yes.
I don't think so. Because here's what I would have to disprove in my head as a prosecutor before I charged. I would have to be confident that I knew that Trump knew that he was asking someone to commit a fraud. Meaning, what if Trump was deluded, or misinformed, or insane, and actually believed he won Georgia? If you actually believe, just bear with me because it's a hypothetical. You don't have to agree with me, just bear with me. If he actually believed he won Georgia, then what would be wrong with calling up the Secretary of State and saying, find me my votes. I won. Where are they? You guys miscounted. So as a prosecutor, and prosecutors are weird, I'm evidence of that, you have to disprove those possibilities in order to successfully bring charges. You don't just charge somebody because you can, which is relatively easy to do. You charge somebody if you think you have a reasonable probability of conviction. So what is he going to be charged with? You know, I don't know. It depends on what they can prove in terms of his intentionality. If it was easy, I submit to you, it would have been done already. I think they're struggling with this. I think this is a really hard thing to do. Both my sisters hate me because I keep telling them, just be patient. They keep writing to me. They text me like every time I'm on television. It's like, when's he going to jail? It's the only question they have for me. And I keep telling them, I don't know that he is. Let me put this in context that may be helpful. Congressman Raskin sat on the January 6th committee, and I think they did a stunningly good job. I thought it was one of the most sort of cogent, thoughtful, linear presentations I had ever seen in Congress. I think most congressional hearings look like the bar scene from Star Wars. But we know that they interviewed about 1,000 people. I'm just making this up, but let's say the average person sat for 6 or 8 hours. Math would be 6,000 to 8,000 hours worth of deposition testimony. They had 10 hearings? 11, 10, 11? They each lasted about 2 hours. We saw 20 hours worth of hearings. Again, I thought they were stunningly good. And there's 8,000 hours worth of deposition testimony out there. As a prosecutor, I'm not relying on 20 hours in order to make a charging decision. I'm relying on 8,000. And unless we see all of that, there's no way in heck I charge the case. Because what's in there? I don't know. I'm not privy to it. Now, I trust the members of Congress who say it's really compelling, but I also think we probably saw the highlights, not the lowlights. And in every case, there are difficulties. Witnesses contradict each other, witnesses forget, sometimes on purpose, sometimes accidentally. That happens all the time. If every one of you was interviewed when you walked out of this room about something I said, there would be 172 different versions. And prosecutors, and all of it in good faith. And prosecutors have to contend with that. So, I'm not there yet. Not that I don't think he deserves it, but if I have to prove my case not on television, but in a courtroom, right, with a federal judge and a defense attorney and cross-examination and a jury of my peers who have to agree unanimously by proof beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime and intentionally so, that's hard. It's a lot harder than my sisters care to hear.
Follow up to Mary Lou's question. Can you prognosticate as to whether the Department of Justice will ever indict Trump in time to forestall his current campaign?
Well, yeah, first of all, the Constitution sets out the qualifications for president, right? But you have to be 35 and a natural-born citizen. That's it. It doesn't say anything about being a convicted felon. So I don't know that you can forestall a campaign for president as a constitutional matter. There are provisions in the Constitution under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, I believe, that speak to whether or not somebody who is an insurrectionist can hold federal office. That's a really interesting law school question, one that Diana would have gotten right and I would have gotten wrong. But I don't know that you can forestall a campaign for president. As far as I know, and actually Congressman Raskin is an expert on this stuff.
So you must be too.
The mechanism to remove somebody from the presidency is, well, there's two. You, the voters, or impeachment. I don't know that you can charge him and forestall a candidacy or even another term in office. And this is what sort of depresses me. If a lot of people in this country don't think his conduct is disqualifying, it certainly seems to me that it would be, it comes down to how people vote. It's just that simple.
Hi, I'm David Naiman. Like you, I'm a DOJ alum, and Bob Mueller is just as great as you said.
Where were you in DOJ?
I was in the executive office for U.S. Attorney.
USA.
So, yes, so I knew him when he was the democratically appointed U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of California. After he was the Republican appointed head of the criminal division and the Republican appointed head of the FBI.
Well, by the way, appointed by a Republican to run the FBI, and reappointed by a Democrat to run the
Yes,
FBI.
thank you. And I should, and Diana's making sure I tell you that my brother is a classmate of you and she.
Oh.
But here's my question for you. You referenced several times to being on the 50-yard line, but it seems like you're now, you and Bob are over on the 20, because there's probably not a Republican elected official in Congress who will say something nice about Bob Mueller. And we know that that's not because he's done anything wrong. But it seems like the football field has changed, and maybe being on the 50-yard line isn't what it used to be.
Well, that's fair. Maybe my analogy is both outdated and useless. It's entirely possible. I guess what I'm trying to say, what I was trying to say is that we need people who think of themselves as an other in political life, who don't care whether the subject of an investigation is a Republican or a Democrat. It just doesn't matter. And that whatever yard line that may be today, I take your point, that's where we need to be. Who was your brother's first name?
Jeff.
Jeff, okay. Did he go to class? Because if he did, I never would have seen him. I was at North Grounds playing pickup basketball for 3 years.
Hello, I'm Margaret Barry, and I actually visited at the law school that Jamie taught at, and started a reentry clinic there, dealing with people who are serving life sentences as juvenile offenders. So when you said the rule of law is always in danger unless we take steps to protect it, I was thinking, well, what do you see as the steps that individuals in the community should be thinking about in terms of that? Because you talked about DOJ and how attorneys within that organization behave or see themselves as behaving. You talked about actually fair versus perceptions. What should we be looking at as individuals when we think about what the rule of law should be? And I went to the actually fair and perceived because I also think that those perceptions are based on certain things that are actually happening that people feel frustrated about.
Oh, I agree with you.
So it's a two-step question.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you know this, the overwhelming experience of Americans with law enforcement is at the state and local level. And the federal presence, we talk about that a lot. It's actually incredibly small. I'll give you a number, and then I'll try and answer your hard question. So does anyone know how many men and women are special agents of the FBI, carry a badge and a gun? About 13,400. That makes them 1/3 the size of the New York City Police Department. Okay? The FBI, the entire cadre of FBI special agents is about 1/3 the size of the New York City Police Department. If you add in DEA and ATF, right, and the other, Secret Service, you probably are at about 25,000 federal agents nationwide, worldwide. Still a fraction of the size of the New York City Police Department. So overwhelmingly, when we talk about law enforcement and criminal justice, we're talking about state and local cops and prosecutors and judges and courts, right? And what can we do on a micro level or on a macro level? On a macro level, we have to insist, just as with teaching and healthcare, that we're getting the best people in these jobs. If someone has a badge and a gun, I want them to be pretty damn good at what they do. How much are we paying them? Who are we attracting to this kind of work, right? I mean, while the FBI has tens of thousands of applicants at any one time, smaller police departments around the country can't fill their ranks. They can't even come close. And so who are we attracting to this line of work? And what are we willing to pay for good healthcare, for good housing, for good transportation, for good education, for good law enforcement? I mean, because that matters. There are about 1 million cops in the country. Sounds like a lot, because it is. You all familiar, I mean, I went to grad school before I went to law school. And for a degree in public policy, I was talking with Diane about. And we had a class in operations research, and linear programming, and regression analysis. I don't know what the hell any of that stuff is. I really struggled with it. But I learned the concept of a bell curve. Bell curve describes all sorts of populations, how tall you are, what your IQ is, whether or not you're, when you're not a golfer, what your golf score is. Everything fits under a bell curve. And about, I think I have this right, about 2.5% of the population is 2 standard deviations to the left. The bad, I don't mean left as in liberal or Republican or conservative, I just mean to the bad side of the curve. Right? If you're measuring IQ, 2.5% of the population is 2 standard deviations away below the average IQ. So this bell curve applies to dentists, it applies to airline pilots, right? And if you lose 2 engines over the Hudson because of a bird strike, you want someone 2 standard deviations to the right of the bell curve at the controls of that plane, like Sully Sullenberger and Jeff Skiles. That's who you want in your plane when you lose 2 engines. If this bell curve applies to law enforcement, and it does, 2.5% of our officers are 2 standard deviations below the average. That's unbelievably dangerous. What's 2.5% of a million? 25,000? Is my math right? So, what do we do? What do we do about the fact that 25,000 officers are probably incapable of doing the work we've asked them to do? Because we don't worry about the folks to the right of the mean, and we don't really even worry about folks that much who are clustered around the mean. And when something really, really, really bad happens, and it happens too often, we're talking about folks who never deserved a badge and a gun. What are we doing as citizens about that? Who are we holding accountable? What are we insisting on? I mean, are we willing to pay more taxes for better stuff? We'll never get perfect, by the way. I mean, I don't believe we'll ever get everyone to the right of the mean. That's not how bell curves work. But I think our courts, our cops, our probation officers, our social workers, I mean, these are things we have to support as citizens. It's absolutely crucial. Are we willing to pay for mental health care? Because so many people in the criminal justice system have mental health issues. And so far, I think the answer is, as a society, we're not. Overwhelmingly, and I know we have some students here who are going to be grappling with the things we broke in the years to come. 99+% of people who go to prison come out again. Our recidivism rate is incredibly high. What are we going to do to drive that down? Are we willing to invest in these people in a reentry program? I think we ought to be. And we don't spend nearly enough on that either. So, what do we do as citizens? We insist that we spend on mental health care, on reentry, on good cops, on good judges, on good public defenders. Why, as a federal prosecutor, was I paid more than my federal public defender counterpart? Her work is every bit as important as mine. Why am I getting paid more? I don't know. I think that's a huge mistake. And until communities around the country insist and are willing to pay for this stuff, we're going to see these disparities. And these disparities are going to have pernicious effects on our society including, maybe most visibly, in our criminal justice system? I don't have a good answer for you.
The next question will be right after I make an announcement about parking. You are getting 2 hours of complimentary parking. You've got to grab a ticket right out here, and when you check out, you put in the one you received first when you came in, and then you put in the ticket you're going to claim out here. So, logistics, and now.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask you about mass murders in the Supreme Court. One of the things
you're not plotting anything, are you?
Would I tell you?
People tell me all kinds of strange things. I don't know.
You said that it's not just actual fairness, but the perception of actual fairness. How many of these mass murders do we need before? I mean, what is the Supreme Court even thinking? And then along with that, related question, is the same thing about voter suppression. I mean, these to me are two absolute bottom line wrongs in our country, and the Supreme Court has taken a pass.
So, I'm not being sarcastic, I promise you. If you want to know what the Supreme Court is thinking, read their decision in Bruin. I mean, they have a very different view of the Second Amendment than I do. By the way, I think Chief Justice Roberts is right when he says, and you may start throwing things at me, but I actually think he's right, so I'm going to tell you. That we're not an illegitimate institution because you disagree with us. Disagreements happen. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is one of my icons and idols as a justice, thought, for instance, that Roe v. Wade was poorly reasoned and poorly decided. She said that, she's written about it. She thought that it could have been put on a much firmer constitutional footing. I think she's right. I remember reading it in law school. Almost like every case I read in law school, Diana, it left me scratching my head. I didn't know what the hell was going on. But I remember thinking about that case, it didn't make a lot of sense to me, although as a matter of public policy, I am absolutely pro-choice, and I was deeply aggrieved when the Dobbs decision came out and overturned 50 years of precedent. But if you go back and actually read Roe v. Wade, you'll see what the Supreme Court was thinking, and you'll see what Ginsburg was saying, that it was not a well-reasoned opinion. I have now that I'm a little bit older and read cases as a teacher, have my students read things that I agree with and disagree with. And I don't think any of that makes the court illegitimate. I don't share the judicial philosophy of the majority of the court. Okay, what were they thinking? I can read it and see. Do I agree with it? In many cases, no. But that's okay. It's an institution I still trust, even though I disagree with them.
I think the best interpretation I've heard, and less generous than yours, is that the Supreme Court is trying to force the legislature to work again and to pass the laws, rather than relying on the court to be that stop.
I've heard that too, and I say something more about that, Diana, because I think it's a reasonable take.
I think people came to hear you, so you say something more. Did you want to add anything, or?
Nope.
Hello there. Hi, I'm Dr. Pallavi. I have a very basic question. What is the premise behind a sitting president being protected when it comes to presenting their tax documents and all of that? We all are law-abiding citizens, and it's insulting when we have to abide by the rules and they are protected. Shouldn't they be more scrutinized than us? What is the premise of that?
So, Doctor, it's a good question. So, the tradition of presidents and candidates for president releasing their tax returns is just that, it's a tradition. It's not required by statute or law or rule or regulation. And because most candidates for that office believe that accountability and transparency are valuable, they release their tax returns. Trump decided not to. There is no law that required him to do so. Now, there is a pretty complicated federal statute. Shows you what a loser I am. I actually know the citation, 26 U.S.C. 6103, which lays out the rules, the procedures for making returns public in very limited circumstances. One such circumstance, I mean, for instance, we could get an order under that statutory provision as federal prosecutors to get returns in connection with a criminal investigation. But another exception in the rule permits the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee to request the return of somebody, in this case the president, in connection with their legislative work. That's what Congressman Neal, he was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee in the past Congress, Democrat from Massachusetts, did. That was the provision he invoked in order to get Trump's returns. Under the Trump administration, they resisted it. And they fought it, and they lost. And under the Biden administration, when Neal renewed his request, they provided it. And that's how Congress got Mr. Trump's returns. The way to punish somebody, anybody, I'm not talking about Trump here, who doesn't abide by norms, is by not electing them to be president of the United States. But the statute doesn't permit your returns or my returns or anyone's returns to be dumped in the public domain because someone feels like it. And in fact, in that sense, you and I have more protection than President Trump, because it would be impossible to imagine a situation in which Congress requested our returns in connection with their legislative work and then made it public. But they requested his returns in connection with their legislative work and did make it public. So, like classified information, this is something we treated very, very carefully. And it's rare to see someone's returns made public. By the way, I'm not sure what legislative purpose the Congress advanced to be critical of it by putting Trump's returns into the public domain. There was a prurient interest. New York Times loved it. You may have read the articles about it. You may have even read the report that accompanied the release of the returns produced by the House Ways and Means Committee. I understand why they wanted to see the returns, because there's a mandatory audit program at the IRS if you're president or vice president. And that didn't happen when Trump was president. And that's an issue. And Congress ought to look at why the Treasury Department did not abide by their mandatory audit program for the President of the United States. That was a good finding that the committee made. How does dumping his returns into the public domain advance that interest? I don't know if I'm on the 50-yard line or the 20-yard line, but I think everybody should be treated according to the rule of law. And I am not sure how Congress advances that by making his returns public. He opted not to do it. His voters did not punish him for it. In my view, game over. But I think I'm in the minority there.
Hello. My question is about Justice Kavanaugh. I've read some things online and in the newspaper about the fact that the FBI really dropped the ball. So what happens now?
I'm so glad you tell me your name.
Oh, Pat Levy.
Pat, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So this is something that I spoke a lot about on television, which would prompt my sisters to simply text me and say, when is he going to jail? Because I don't think they listen to anything I say. Which is certainly true growing up as well. So Pat, this is going to strike you as weird, but here's the answer. If the FBI opens up an investigation of Diana for mail fraud, all right, they can do whatever it is they believe, as long as it's pursuant to law, that they need to do to investigate her. They can get whatever records they want. They can interview whatever witnesses they want. They have a huge amount of authority, okay? When the FBI is asked to do a background investigation for someone nominated by the president to be Secretary of Commerce or Supreme Court Justice or the Attorney General or the Director of the FBI does not have the authority, to do a full investigation. They have the authority to do as much as the person, the president, asks them to do. Make sense? No. It doesn't make a ton of sense. This is not the FBI in their criminal investigative role. So when the president says, thanks, I got all I need, and 4,000 tips come into the FBI about Justice Kavanaugh or Diana Conway or whoever has been nominated to a high-level position, the FBI will say to the client, essentially, hey, we got 4,000 tips. This looks really bad. You want us to, do more stuff? And in this case, the White House said, no, thanks, we got what we need. The FBI has a memorandum of understanding with the White House, all presidents, all parties, both parties, that their role in these background investigations is completely different than their criminal investigative authority. So they took the fall on this. I mean, over and over and over again, you would hear on television, what the FBI sucks. They're pulling their punches. Why are they not investigating Kavanaugh? They have all of these tips coming in. What are they doing? And the answer is they are working pursuant to the memorandum of understanding they have with the White House on background investigations for high-level nominees. So a lot of I tell my sisters this, and they say, well, when is he going to be indicted? This is sort of, there's some nuance and layer here, and it doesn't make intuitive sense, but that's what happened.
We're going to take one last question.
I'm Scott, and I'm going to go back to the Department of Justice and integrity or perception of integrity or actually the reality of integrity. We had a past administration that decided that it may want to just plant people into the Department of Justice. Someone who's willing to do my will is almost like a job interview that lasts longer than yours. But to say, if you will do this, I will put you at the highest levels of the Justice Department. You talked about the Justice Department is full of good people and they're highly intelligent, and I believe that. Right. Is the Justice Department strong enough to be able to withhold the political pressure of a president who may want to get back in and all of a sudden say, it's payback time, I'm going to change the Department of Justice? Or is it strong enough in itself as an institution to preserve and protect what we need for justice?
Yeah, it's such a good question. The answer is, I think so. I hope so. And time will tell, right? So when, I can think of three, and Diana, we have a few minutes left.
All day if you want.
All right, all day, that's fine. When you think about a couple of episodes in Department of Justice history, and I was honored to be privileged to be part of one of them, there are times when the men and women, the rank and file, were carrying resignation letters around with them and about to walk out. This happened purportedly when Trump wanted to install Jeffrey Clark as the acting Attorney General. And a lot of people, including Republican appointees like Richard Donahue and Jeffrey Rosen, said, hell no, and stood up to the president and backed him down. Because they said, if this happens, we're not the only ones walking out of here. There's going to be a bunch of us. And you're going to have a problem on your hands unlike anything you have. There's going to be a firestorm unlike anything you've ever seen. So did the dam hold in that instance? And the answer is yes. I was involved in one. You may recall this. There was a showdown in the hospital room of John Ashcroft. All right. Jim Comey was the Deputy Attorney General at the time. I was his Chief of Staff. Bob Mueller was the Director of the FBI. And the White House wanted the Attorney General of the United States to certify the legality of a very sensitive surveillance program that was being used post 9/11. Ashcroft got pancreatitis. He was very, very, very sick and went to GW Hospital, which made Jim Comey the acting Attorney General of the United States while Ashcroft was bedridden. And wouldn't you know it, but like that day, that program came up for recertification. And Comey said, I'm not signing this. I don't believe that there is a firm constitutional footing for it. And there was literally, sounds like a bad movie, in part because it was, a showdown in Ashcroft's hospital room when two emissaries came from the White House to get him to sign the document. And Jim Comey and Bob Mueller raced to GW Hospital to intercept them. And whatever you may think of John Ashcroft, and I'm guessing a lot of people in this room don't think very much of him, he propped himself up on one elbow because we fortunately got there in time to brief him about what was happening. He was very, very sick. He propped himself up on one elbow and told the emissaries from the White House, I am not the Attorney General of the United States, which was true at that moment. That's the Attorney General over there, pointing to Jim Comey, all 6'9" of him, standing in the corner. You deal with him. And he collapsed. And the White House folks left. And Comey and Mueller ended up meeting separately with George Bush over the next day or two. And George Bush didn't agree, because I think he was poorly staffed on this issue, very poorly staffed, agreed to all the changes that Mueller and Comey insisted upon to this program to ensure it was placed anew on a constitutional footing so it could go forward. There were a whole bunch of us, 20 on my count, that were prepared to resign that night. Because, by the way, the president doesn't need the Attorney General to certify that a program is lawful. The president's the head of the executive branch. The Attorney General is a subordinate official. So with or without the Attorney General's certification, the president as commander-in-chief, any president, Obama, Clinton, Reagan, Ford, doesn't matter, any president can order a program to go forward if he believes it's related to the national security of the United States with his commander-in-chief hat on. And they backed out. This happens, look, you don't threaten the president of the United States because you disagree with him, and I hope very soon her. You don't threaten to resign because you disagree with a policy or a program. But there have been times in the life of the Department of Justice where the men and women, the rank and file, have stood up for the rule of law and have won. And look, I don't want it to happen very often, meaning I don't want to get to that point very often. But I have seen the institution hold, and I've seen it hold multiple times. And so, you know, the simple answer to your really, really good question is, I think so and I hope so. But the other part of that answer, honestly, is time will tell. Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of the speaker's mic and ask you a final question, which is, did Gerald Ford make a mistake by pardoning his predecessor?
Such a great question, Diana. Did Gerald Ford make a mistake? I don't think so. And I wrote an article about this. So Ted Kennedy excoriated Ford at the time for pardoning Richard Nixon. Now, the analogy between Nixon and Trump isn't great, other than they were, you know, sort of both criminals. Nixon abided a Supreme Court decision to turn over tapes and documents. And Nixon resigned and went away. So the analogy is not perfect. But Ford pardoned him because he believed that the nation had to look forward and not back. And that a criminal trial of Richard Nixon would have been unbelievably distracting and destructive. So Kennedy and others excoriated Ford. Ford actually went to testify on Capitol Hill, very unusual for a president. It's happened a few times, but Ford did it because he wanted to explain his thinking. And he just got the hell beat out of him. So 25 years later, June of 2001, so now we're a few months before the attacks of 9/11, which may be why nobody remembers this, Ted Kennedy presented to Gerald Ford at the Kennedy Library in Boston the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award for pardoning Richard Nixon. And he said, you know what? Ford was right, and I didn't see it at the time, and I was wrong. The nation did need to move past this, and Ford saw it in a way that I, Ted Kennedy, did not. So was Ford wrong to pardon Nixon? Not in my view. I wrote an article suggesting that President Biden ought to consider pardoning Donald Trump. You're welcome to disagree. I mean, that's one of the things that makes this a great country. I wrote it because that's what I believe. There's an interesting Supreme Court case, Burdick, I think, from 1918. It stands for the proposition that the acceptance of a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt. And Ford carried around that excerpt from the Burdick case in his wallet until the day he died. And I think he got it right, because at least then it helped the nation heal and move on. People don't seem to be that forgiving these days. And again, I completely get that the analogy is different, because if someone told you that Trump would just go away, you might be more inclined to agree with me. But I think it's a really hard question, and a really good one, and one that we ought to think about as a nation if we're going to fix all this stuff that's broken. Again, that's on you guys back there, and move forward. So anyway, thank you very much for
all right, well, thank you everybody for staying and listening to our amazing speaker. Just want to remind you of the parking directions, grab a ticket, and February 3rd, Dr. Fiona Hill, sign up online for the Zoom, and February 21st, Jason Green. And please become a WDC member, join a committee, and help save our democracy. Thank you, everyone.